Class, I'd like to introduce our next lecture, which is going to be two lectures in one, or two chapters in one. This lecture, which covers about 19 slides, will address the subjects of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, as well as personality disorders. Um, I do want to say at the outset that when we get into the realm of personality disorders, this is an area in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders that is different from a lot of the other disorders in this one key area, and that is that psychopharmacology tends to play less of a role in that class of disorders than it does in the other classes of disorders. I remember something that a very wise professor told me when I was in graduate school myself. He said that when you enter the realm of personality disorders and start talking about personality disorders, you really are entering into the realm of the psychologist, because personality disorders, as you probably already know, tend to be characterological in nature. They tend to be very deeply entrenched into a person's psyche. Usually they can only be diagnosed after a person has exhibited symptoms for upwards of 10 years or more, usually only diagnosed in adults as a rule. And they are seen as being more purely psychological in origin and in nature and in course. So when we talk about personality disorders, that's where we really do start to find treatment options that are less psychopharmacological in nature and much more conventionally psychological in nature. Therefore, you'll see a lot of references when you get into the treatment of personality disorders to classical theorists and clinicians like Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, Alfred Adler, and so on and so forth. You will see some references to behavioral psychologists as well. But just know that when it comes to the treatment of personality disorders, the focus tends to be very, very long. Therapy often takes years as opposed to, say, weeks or months. Most clinical psychologists and therapists who address personality disorders professionally find that their patients will have symptoms usually for many, many years, um, and that treatment often takes many, many years. A good rule of thumb is that for about every 2 years that a person has a personality disorder, it takes about 1 year of treatment. There's not a lot of research or quotes on that. It's an informal observation taken from many of my peers and my colleagues, but it's a good rule of thumb. At the very least, it's important to adopt a long-term outlook when it comes to the treatment of personality disorders. So we'll first talk for several slides about post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, which has received a lot of attention in the literature in recent years. And we'll talk about some of the pharmacological treatments for PTSD as well. So let's move on here to the first slide, which is slide number 2 in this slide presentation. And we'll talk about PTSD. So as a quick reminder, PTSD is a psychological disorder or a psychiatric disorder, I'll use those terms interchangeably here, in which a person has been exposed to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violation. And one or more of the following is required for a diagnosis, and that is that the sufferer must have directly experienced the traumatic event. They must have witnessed the event in person. They must have learned that the event occurred to a close family member or close friend, with the actual or threatened death being either violent or accidental. Or they must have had firsthand repeated or extreme exposure to aversive details of the event, for example, not through media. And so you'll notice there in the diagnosis section, when it comes to different symptoms, that typically PTSD is not going to be say, associated with someone who has seen a lot of media violence, for example, or in the aftermath of a disaster, if there has been news coverage of a serious event, even though some people say that they have been affected by media depictions of violence or disasters, traditionally that's not reserved for the diagnosis of PTSD. Now, there is some evidence in recent years that has suggested that people may be softening on that very hard position on PTSD, suggesting that we could get some sort of traumatic response to violent depictions in the media, whether they are fictionalized accounts, such as in a movie, or if they are documentary style or journalistic style, where they are news media members reporting on factual details of a serious or violent matter. But for now, we'll talk about the traditional view. There are two subtypes of PTSD, as you see down here: preschool and then dissociative. The preschool subtype exists because it's now being witnessed in children. That is, the symptoms of PTSD are now being observed in children, and children tend to have lower diagnostic thresholds, meaning that they tend to be diagnosed without as many serious symptoms, and it doesn't take as much to get a child to experience some of the symptoms of PTSD.